At the height of the Second World War, a little-known threat loomed in the icy waters of northern Norway, a threat so significant that Winston Churchill himself called it the Beast. It was the German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the notorious Bismarck, and by early 1943 it had become one of the most feared naval weapons in the world. Anchored deep inside Altenfjord, hidden among towering cliffs and swirling Arctic fog, Tirpitz posed a constant danger to Allied convoys supplying the Soviet Union. Few outside high command understood just how much of the war's northern strategy revolved around this single ship. Fewer still could imagine the lengths the Royal Navy would go to neutralize it. The struggle began with a hard truth. Conventional attacks simply could not get close enough. Tirpitz was embedded in a fortress of natural and man-made defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the surrounding hillsides. Torpedo nets crisscrossed the fjord like an underwater labyrinth. German patrol boats prowled the waters day and night. And the geography itself, narrow channels, twisting inlets, and steep mountains, made any surface or aerial assault an exercise in futility. British air raids launched from Scotland often returned without even locating the battleship, their crews frustrated and chilled to the bone by the Arctic winds. In March 1943, Rear Admiral Lionel Wells put it bluntly in his assessment. "We can find her. We can reach her. We cannot hit her." This conundrum forced the Admiralty to consider unconventional methods. The Special Operations Executive had already proven that small teams could achieve outsized results on land. Now, naval planners wondered, could a similar approach succeed underwater? It was Commander Max Horton, head of the Royal Navy's submarine service, who championed the idea that would become Operation Source. Horton believed that a new experimental craft, the X-class midget submarine, offered a unique solution. Barely 51 feet long, crewed by just 4 men, and designed to slip beneath defenses undetected, these subs could potentially go where no fleet could. Their mission would be simple in concept, but nearly impossible in execution. Navigate 1,000 miles under tow, infiltrate the fjord, plant 2 tons of explosives beneath Tirpitz, and escape into the Arctic night. The idea was bold, bordering on reckless, and even the X-craft designers were hesitant. Trials conducted along the Scottish coast exposed the craft's limitations. They leaked. Their engines overheated. Navigation equipment failed at the worst moments. But they also demonstrated something else, an uncanny ability to operate in confined spaces, glide through underwater nets, and carry demolition charges capable of crippling a battleship. If any vessel could defeat Tirpitz's fortress, it was this one. Still, there was an element of mystery surrounding Altenfjord itself. Intelligence reports gathered from Norwegian resistance networks described unusual German movements. New barriers being installed, patrols shifting unpredictably, supply ships coming and going at odd hours. Something about the enemy's schedule seemed to elude observers. Some SOE agents suspected the Germans were testing counter-infiltration techniques. Others believed they were hiding vulnerabilities they didn't want the Allies to discover. Whatever the truth, it created an atmosphere of uncertainty. The British would be sending men into waters where every tide, every echo, every shadow could conceal a new danger. For the men of the 12th Submarine Flotilla, chosen to command the X-craft, the challenge was both technical and deeply personal. Many were in their early 20s, volunteering for a mission described in briefings only as hazardous and without precedent. One diary entry from Lieutenant Cameron "Cam" Lindsay, later assigned to X6, captured the mixture of anxiety and determination. "We know what Tirpitz represents. If we don't stop her, she may break out one day and slaughter convoys that cannot defend themselves. If these little subs are our best chance, then so be it." Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, preparations intensified. Remote Scottish lochs became testing grounds for daring underwater maneuvers. Engineers reinforced hulls, fine-tuned engines, and experimented with ways to breach torpedo nets. The Admiralty reviewed charts of Altenfjord until the paper wore thin. And all the while, Tirpitz remained untouched, immense, silent, and ominously patient. By August, the operation was approved. Selected crews were briefed on their mission with the gravity befitting something close to suicidal. But despite the planning, uncertainties remained. The fjord's currents were unpredictable. The German patrol schedule was incomplete. And there were conflicting accounts, whispers, really, about unexplained disturbances detected in the water near Tirpitz in recent months. Some believed the Germans had already thwarted a previous attempt. Others argued the reports were misinterpretations of wildlife or natural shifting currents. No one knew for certain. What was clear, however, was this. The Royal Navy was about to deploy some of the smallest submarines ever used in combat against one of the largest battleships ever constructed. It was an asymmetry so bold it bordered on impossible. And as the crews prepared to depart, one question lingered among planners and operators alike. Could these tiny steel vessels truly reach a target that had remained immune to every Allied assault so far? The answer, and the mystery, would soon unfold beneath the cold, dark waters of Norway's far north. In the quiet coves and wind-swept lochs of northern Scotland, a secretive transformation was underway in the spring and summer of 1943. Few locals understood why remote anchorages suddenly filled with strange, compact submarines. Steel cylinders barely longer than a fishing boat, painted in dull grays and greens to blend into the sea. Even fewer understood the grueling training unfolding behind closed boathouse doors. These were the Royal Navy's X-class submarines, and the men who trained inside them were preparing for one of the most ambitious underwater missions in military history. What they faced in those months would push them to the limits of endurance, ingenuity, and nerve. The X-craft crews belonged to the 12th Submarine Flotilla, commanded by Captain W.D. Stevens. Officially, their training was classified as Special Underwater Operations. But the men knew better. Rumors circulated that their tiny subs would soon face the Tirpitz, the nearly invulnerable German giant guarding northern Norway. Achieving that meant learning to endure cramped spaces, pitch-black conditions, and the near-constant threat of mechanical malfunction. Inside these 51-foot-long craft, 4 men lived, worked, and navigated in what could only be described as a metal coffin with an engine. From the first day, instructors hammered home a stark truth. If something went wrong inside an X-craft, there was almost no room to fix it. Engines vibrated violently, generating deafening noise. Condensation dripped from every surface, leaving clothing and equipment perpetually damp. The air was thick with oil fumes, battery acid, and sweat. Lieutenant John Lorimer, later assigned to X7, wrote in a private letter, "There are moments when the craft feels alive, groaning, shuddering, sighing, as though it resents our presence. You must learn to trust it, even as you fear it." The struggle, however, was not merely physical. Navigating a mini-submarine required a rare combination of nerve, precision, and intuition. The men practiced maneuvering through simulated torpedo nets, ropes strung underwater in Scottish lochs to mimic the barriers guarding Alton Fjord. They rehearsed cutting through steel wires while submerged, relying only on touch and whispered communication. They learned to dive by inches, skimming the seabed without stirring silt that might expose their presence. Every movement had to be deliberate. A single miscalculation, the instructors reminded them, could mean entanglement, sinking, or discovery by enemy patrols. Training officers also understood that the mission would involve long periods of isolation. The X-craft would be towed behind full-sized submarines for hundreds of miles, the crew locked inside with only the churn of the propeller and the creak of metal to fill the silence. To simulate this ordeal, the men were sealed inside the subs for extended trials, 36 hours at a time, emerging pale, exhausted, and blinking at the Scottish sunlight. Lieutenant Donald Cameron, destined for command of X6, noted in his diary, "You become aware of sounds no ordinary sailor hears, the scrape of a wire against the hull, the faintest change in water pressure. You live by these sounds." Despite the intensity of preparation, a sense of mystery hovered around the operation. Planners withheld details of the fjord's exact layout, sharing only fragments necessary for training. Some crewmen wondered privately why intelligence officers seemed unusually concerned about German defensive patterns. Were new patrols being added? Had the enemy become suspicious? One briefing document hinted vaguely at recent environmental disturbances near Alton Fjord, an ambiguous phrase that sparked quiet speculation among the men. Were the Germans experimenting with new detection technologies? Or had something unexpected been discovered beneath the water? Nothing more was explained. Nevertheless, the crews pressed on, driven by a mix of daring and duty. The Admiralty brought in engineers from Vickers and Rolls-Royce to inspect the X-craft engines, reinforcing key components and making last-minute modifications. New escape hatches were tested. Navigation compasses were recalibrated repeatedly to ensure accuracy under Arctic conditions. At night, officers huddled over dimly lit charts, discussing routes, tides, and infiltration angles. Every detail mattered. By late August 1943, the men of the flotilla could operate their craft almost instinctively. They had rehearsed emergency flooding procedures, demolition charge placement, and silent running protocols until muscle memory took over. Still, the unknowns weighed heavily. Within the cramped wardrooms of their parent submarines, officers exchanged glances that needed no words. They understood the danger ahead. Not all craft would reach their destination. Not all crews would return. And yet, something remarkable had happened during those demanding months. The crews had developed a deep, quiet confidence in one another. Each man knew the other's rhythms, strengths, and fears. They had become a team bound by steel, sweat, and secrecy. As the flotilla prepared to depart for Norway, final messages were written home, carefully worded, revealing nothing. Equipment was loaded. Engines were checked for the last time. The Scottish winds carried the smell of the sea and the weight of uncertainty. Ahead lay 1,000 miles of cold, hostile water and a fortress guarded by one of the most formidable battleships ever built. The men had trained tirelessly. They were ready. But none could yet know just how many obstacles the Arctic would place before them, or how quickly their carefully laid plans would begin to unravel once the journey began. In early September 1943, beneath gray North Atlantic skies, 6 X-class submarines were quietly secured behind their much larger parent submarines. It was the beginning of the journey that would define Operation Source. Each X-craft, X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, and X10, was lashed to a towline, a fragile link between survival and disaster. Few missions in the Royal Navy's long history began with such a precarious setup. The men inside the parent submarines, HMS Scepter, Sea Nymph, Stubborn, and Thrasher, looked over their shoulders, knowing they were responsible for towing the smallest vessels ever assigned to attack one of the largest warships ever built. From the moment the flotilla left Loch Cairnbon, the struggle began. The X-craft were designed for stealth, not endurance, and the long tow was their greatest vulnerability. Heavy seas tossed the tiny subs like toys. Tow lines strained, creaked, and snapped under the pressure. Officers aboard HMS Scepter, towing X8, recorded in their log that the sea state was unfavorable for continued towing, a typically restrained naval understatement for conditions that threatened to destroy the mission before it had even begun. The first serious setback came when structural issues emerged aboard X8. Leaks developed in her side charges, the very explosives meant to cripple the tearpits. Despite the crew's best efforts to contain the flooding and stabilize the craft, the situation worsened. After frantic attempts to preserve her, Captain W.D. Stevens made the painful decision. X8 had to be scuttled to prevent danger to the parent submarine. The charges were rendered safe, and the vessel was sunk on September 10th. The loss was a heavy blow, a preview of the unpredictable obstacles still ahead. Worse still was what happened to X9. Towed behind HMS Scepter, the tiny sub had been performing well, until the tow line suddenly jerked. In the following moment of chaos, the line went slack. Instead of surfacing as expected, X9 vanished. Investigators believed she likely suffered catastrophic flooding, sinking instantly with all hands. Lieutenant E. Kieran and his crew were never seen again. In the parent submarine's quiet wardroom, the news felt like a gut punch. One officer later wrote, "It was as though the sea had swallowed them without a sound." The disappearance of X9 added a grim layer of mystery to the mission. No alarms, no distress signals, only absence. With 2 craft gone and 4 remaining, the reality of the operation's dangers became undeniable. Yet the surviving crews pressed on. By September 16, the flotilla reached the edge of the Norwegian coast. Each parent submarine now faced the perilous task of releasing its X-craft for the final, independent approach into Alten Fjord. This moment, untethering from their escorts, marked the true beginning of the assault. The process was delicate. The parent submarines had to surface briefly, risking detection by German aircraft and patrol boats. Sea mist clung to the water, offering some concealment but also complicating navigation. Inside HMS Stubborn, Lieutenant Basil Place prepared to take X7 on her own power. He later recalled the eerie silence as the deck crew whispered final instructions while German-held shores loomed in the distance. Once submerged, the X-craft became dark, isolated worlds, the men inside now entirely dependent on their training and on the fragile machinery around them. Almost immediately, new difficulties emerged. The Arctic waters were colder and more turbulent than expected, and mechanical strains intensified. X-10 suffered major gyrocompass failures, forcing Lieutenant K. Hudspeth to abort the mission and withdraw, a decision no commander ever wished to make, but one essential to keep his men alive. X-5, under Lieutenant Henty Creer, experienced radio silence and navigational uncertainty. Some accounts suggest she may have been detected by German patrols. Others imply she was forced deep by unexpected currents. The records remain ambiguous, contributing to one of the enduring mysteries of Operation Source. Meanwhile, X6 and X7, commanded by Donald Cameron and Basil Place, fought their way through the underwater defenses surrounding Alten Fjord. They encountered uncharted nets, hidden shallows, and shifting thermal layers that repeatedly threw off their depth gauges. Debris from German activity drifted beneath the surface, occasionally scraping hulls, raising the terrifying possibility that they had been detected. Cameron later described hearing a metallic clang along X6's side, followed by a moment where every man held his breath, waiting for a depth charge that never came. Despite setbacks, the silent approach continued. The X-craft crept through minefields, sometimes navigating within mere feet of explosive devices. Both Cameron and Place relied less on instruments and more on instinct, their craft responding sluggishly, sometimes unpredictably, as they edged toward the inner fjord. Each minute felt stretched into an hour, every sound amplified by the cramped metal shells protecting them from the crushing pressure outside. As the remaining X-craft closed in on the entrance to Alten Fjord, tension on board reached its peak. The crews had already lost friends. They had seen 2 X-craft disappear and another forced to retreat. Yet they pressed on into waters no Allied submarine had ever successfully infiltrated. What none of them could foresee was that the greatest challenges, and the most mysterious events of the mission, still lay ahead, waiting beneath the shadow of the Tirpitz herself. The inner reaches of Alten Fjord were a world unlike any the X-craft crews had ever navigated, silent, enclosed, and dominated by the massive shadow of the German battleship Tirpitz. In late September 1943, as X6 and X7 entered the final phase of their approach, the fjord lay under a low Arctic mist, the morning light barely penetrating the towering cliffs. This natural fortress, chosen by the Kriegsmarine precisely for its defensive advantages, turned the last leg of Operation Source into a slow-motion struggle between human resolve and the calculated layers of German protection. That 2 mini-submarines even reached this point remains one of the most remarkable underwater infiltrations of the war. Alten Fjord's defenses were complex and multi-layered. Anti-submarine nets spanned its narrow choke points, reinforced with steel mesh and weighted cables. Patrol boats circled the anchorages in irregular patterns designed to confound any prediction of their movements. Hydrophones, early underwater listening devices, were anchored along the fjord floor. Above them, watchmen scanned the water from platforms carved into the cliffs. The Tirpitz, moored in Kofjord, sat behind an array of torpedo nets arranged in concentric rings, each one shifted slightly every few days. German records later confirmed that the battleship's captain, Hans Meyer, believed the fjord to be impregnable by underwater approach. And yet, in the early hours of September 22, 1943, X6 and X7 slipped into this gauntlet, battling the elements as much as the enemy. Their first struggle was depth control. The fjord's cold layers of water triggered sudden buoyancy shifts. Pressure differences between salt and freshwater pockets caused unexpected lurches. Lieutenant Cameron in X6 fought continuously with the trim system, sometimes flying the submarine manually by adjusting ballast while shouting quick corrections to his crew. Cameron later wrote, "It was like steering through darkness with only instinct to guide us." Soon came the first nets. Outdated maps had given only partial information, and the craft often encountered barriers where none were expected. X6 became entangled in its first net near the entrance to the inner fjord. For nearly 20 minutes, the crew worked in tense silence, reversing engines, adjusting pitch, and using the craft's small electric motor to rock themselves free. Every scrape risked detection. With a final violent jerk, the X-craft tore loose, but the collision damaged its periscope and gyrocompass, leaving Cameron with far fewer tools to navigate. X7 faced similar challenges. Lieutenant Basil Place maneuvered cautiously, using a combination of depth readings, chart memory, and sound cues from the fjord walls to orient himself. He recalled hearing patrol boats above, their propellers echoing through the water like thunder amplified in a cavern. Place ordered the engines to creep at minimal speed. Silence became their greatest weapon, but also their greatest vulnerability. Creeping made them nearly blind to currents and underwater hazards. Amid these physical struggles, a quieter mystery unfolded. Both crews reported hearing sounds they couldn't identify, metallic resonance that seemed out of place and not caused by patrol boats or nets. Some suspected it was maintenance work aboard Tirpitz. Others believed it came from shifting underwater debris. German logs later mentioned short disturbances in hydrophone clarity around this same time, but offered no explanation. Historians still debate whether the sounds were natural, mechanical, or the result of the fjord's complex acoustics. Whatever the cause, they added tension to the already nerve-wracking infiltration. As dawn approached, the X-craft entered the innermost ring of defenses. They were now within striking distance of the battleship. The Tirpitz, nearly 53,000 tons of steel, loomed overhead, a vast, unseen mass that displaced the water and created subtle pressure shifts detectable inside the tiny subs. The crews felt the air thicken and the hull vibrate faintly as they passed beneath the shadow of the giant warship. At approximately 7 o'clock, X6 surfaced briefly within the net enclosure to fix its bearings. Almost immediately, it was spotted by a German watchman. Machine gun fire erupted, and Cameron crashed scraping the hull against the battleship's underwater plating. This accident, dangerous though it was, also placed them exactly where they needed to be, beneath Tirpitz herself. With their periscopes smashed and navigation nearly impossible, Cameron made the bold decision to proceed by feel, relying on the vibrations of the ship above to position their charges. X7's path proved only slightly less chaotic. Place managed to navigate through a small gap between net sections, likely created during routine maintenance. He brought X7 under the battleship's central section, carefully aligning the sub beneath the keel. Later analysis suggested that this feat required extraordinary precision, just a few feet off in either direction, and the charges would have failed to deliver their full impact. Finally, after hours of tension and improvisation, both crews reached their targets. They released their 2-ton side charges, massive containers of amatol designed to explode after a timed delay. Each placed explosive drifted into position, settling in the dark silence beneath Germany's most feared warship. With their mission complete, the crews attempted to escape, but their paths were cut off. Cameron and Place both realized they were trapped. German patrol craft were closing in, nets blocked their exits, and their craft were running low on power. Capture was inevitable. Yet as they prepared to scuttle their subs and surrender, one fact remained: the charges were set. Tirpitz was wounded, she just didn't know it yet. And as X6 and X7's crews were pulled from the water by bewildered German sailors, one question lingered. What had happened to X5, the third craft that should have arrived alongside them, but never appeared? When the charges placed beneath Tirpitz detonated at 8:12 on the morning of September 22, 1943, the fjord itself seemed to convulse. A thunderous roar echoed off the cliffs of Kofjord, sending shockwaves rippling across the water. German sailors were knocked from ladders, equipment flew from shelves, and for several seconds the 53,000-ton battleship, pride of the Kriegsmarine, lurched violently before settling into the fjord in a sickening tilt. Smoke and spray shot skyward. Below decks, lights flickered, pipework ruptured, and compartments flooded. It was the moment Operation Source had aimed toward for months, yet for the men who had carried out the attack, the outcome was unknown. Cameron, Place, and their surviving crews were already prisoners aboard the very ship they had just crippled. The damage, as later reports attested, was catastrophic. The explosions tore open large sections of the battleship's hull, destroying boiler rooms and engineering compartments. Water flooded in, drowning machinery and leaving Tippets dead in the water. Although the crew fought desperately to contain the flooding, the battleship took on thousands of tons of seawater. Her power systems failed, her turrets locked. The Germans soon realized that the ship's fighting capability had been neutralized for months, perhaps permanently. Yet amidst the chaos of repair efforts and frantic damage assessments, one question hung unanswered: how many submarines had reached them? German officers counted 2 captured X-craft crews. They interrogated Cameron and Place, who provided only name, rank, and serial number. But the wreckage of a 3rd X-craft appeared nowhere. Rumors circulated among the prisoners. Had X-5 made it through the nets? Had she been destroyed before releasing her charges? Both possibilities seemed plausible, yet neither could be confirmed. For the families back home, and for historians decades later, the fate of X-5 would remain one of the enduring mysteries of the operation. The first clues emerged from German operational logs. At approximately 7:40, just before the blast, a patrol boat reported engaging what it believed to be a small submarine near the torpedo net perimeter. Depth charges were dropped, but visibility was poor. Hours later, fragments of metal were recovered near the engagement site, though German officers could not definitively link them to X-5. The patrol crew insisted they had destroyed an unknown sub. But Cameron and Place, based on the timing of sounds they heard while inside Tippets, believed X-5 might have reached the target area before being lost. Combined, the evidence only deepened the question. Had X-5 succeeded in placing charges that detonated alongside those of X-6 and X-7, or did she perish short of the target? Meanwhile, aboard the damaged battleship, German officers sought explanations. How had British submarines gotten through their defenses? Had Norwegian resistance fighters assisted them? Were there unknown vulnerabilities in the net system? Interviews with crew members show a mix of disbelief and grudging admiration. One engineer wrote in his log after the attack that such small vessels could approach us. It defies logic. Another noted that hydrophone readings earlier that morning had been inconclusive, raising questions about acoustic anomalies inside the fjord. Whether these were caused by underwater currents, structural vibrations from the nets, or the movement of the X-craft remains uncertain. German Naval Command scrambled to secure the area. Patrol boats swept the fjord. Divers inspected netting for additional breaches. Meanwhile, Cameron and Place were transferred to a shore facility for further interrogation. Though treated as prisoners of war, they were viewed by many German officers as unusually determined adversaries. When the extent of the damage to Tippets became clear, even the Kriegsmarine acknowledged the attack's boldness. Records from later inquiries show that some officers believed 3 submarines had penetrated the net enclosure, supporting the possibility that X-5 had indeed reached the target. For the Royal Navy, word of the attack took days to travel back. Parent submarines that had released the X-craft were already withdrawing from Norwegian waters, carrying only uncertain reports. When confirmation finally arrived, a quiet but profound sense of accomplishment spread through the 12th Submarine Flotilla. Despite losses, the mission had succeeded where fleets and air forces had failed. Tippets was crippled and would not return to operational readiness for at least 6 months. This delay, in turn, secured critical Arctic convoys that would otherwise have been threatened during the winter of 1943-44. Yet satisfaction was tempered by grief. Memorial services were held aboard the parent submarines as they received news of the losses. The men of X-9 and X-8 were already known to be gone, but uncertainty over X-5 weighed heavily. Some believed she had placed charges that contributed to the strike. Others argued she had been lost before completing her mission. Official recognition after the war would honor the bravery of Lieutenant Henty Creer and his crew, but the lack of definitive evidence meant their final actions would remain unknown. In the years since, divers and historians have undertaken numerous investigations into Kofjord. Sonar scans have revealed debris fields, but none conclusively tied to X5. Some sonar signatures suggest a small craft may lie beneath layers of silt, but the fjord's shifting geology complicates analysis. The mystery persists, one of those wartime moments where bravery intersects with uncertainty and the truth remains submerged beyond reach. As Tippets lay crippled in Kofjord, her fate sealed for the foreseeable future, a final question loomed over Operation Source. What would become of the captured crews, and how would their bold attack shape the course of the Arctic War? In the hours following the explosions beneath Tippets, the men of X6 and X7 were marched ashore under armed guard, tired, soaked, and still processing the enormity of what they had accomplished. For the first time since embarking on their perilous mission, they found themselves standing on solid ground, surrounded by the very enemy they had just struck a decisive blow against. It was an uneasy moment, triumph and captivity intertwined. The German sailors who escorted them looked bewildered, even shaken. They had just witnessed their mighty battleship, supposedly untouchable, crippled by two vessels smaller than a coastal fishing boat. The prisoners were taken to a small interrogation facility near Kofjord. There, German officers attempted to glean details about the miniature submarines, their operating methods, and whether additional craft had been dispatched. Yet Cameron, Place, and their surviving crewmen offered only the bare essentials allowed under the Geneva Conventions: name, rank, serial number. Their refusal to elaborate frustrated some interrogators, but others seemed almost impressed by the discipline. One German officer reportedly told a British prisoner, "You have done what no air fleet could achieve. For this, we cannot hate you." The struggle for the prisoners soon shifted from the tension of combat to the grinding uncertainty of captivity. They were transported south to Dulag Nord, and from there to camps in Germany, Stalag 18A and Marlag Milog Nord, facilities designated for naval prisoners. Although treatment varied by circumstance and captor, the captured X-craft crews generally received a measure of respect. The Germans recognized their mission as extraordinarily hazardous, and even propaganda broadcasts cautiously acknowledged the English midget submarines as weapons of remarkable ingenuity. Life in the camps, however, remained harsh. The men endured shortages, strict routines, and the isolation of being among the few submariners captured during the Arctic War. In one diary entry smuggled after the war, a British sailor recorded Cameron reflecting quietly, "We did what we came to do. Whether we see home again, I cannot say, but we struck the blow." Their thoughts often drifted to the crews of X5, X8, and X9, friends whose fates were either known or painfully uncertain. Even in captivity, the mystery of X5 lingered. Rumors filtered through from Red Cross messages and German guards, but none brought clarity. Meanwhile, across the North Atlantic, news of the mission spread slowly but decisively. British Naval Command received initial confirmation from reconnaissance flights showing Tippets listing heavily, supported by tugboats. Further reports from Norwegian resistance contacts and intercepted German communications confirmed the extent of the damage. The Admiralty's coded summary stated simply, "Tippets crippled. Source effective." Behind closed doors, senior officers allowed themselves a rare moment of relief. The battleship's threat to the Arctic convoys had been neutralized at a critical point in the war. The mission's significance extended far beyond the sinking of a single ship. With Tippets incapacitated, the Kriegsmarine lost its last major surface threat in the northern theater. Convoys carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food to the Soviet Union resumed with renewed confidence. Historians would later argue that by removing Tippets from the equation, Operation Source contributed to sustaining the Eastern Front at a pivotal moment, one where Soviet forces were preparing major offensives against German positions. Recognition for the operation soon followed. Newsreels and newspapers celebrated the daring attack, though many details remained classified. Captain Donald Cameron and Lieutenant Basil Place were awarded the Victoria Cross for their leadership and courage. Other crew members received Distinguished Service Orders and Distinguished Service Medals. Yet despite the accolades, the men themselves often expressed humility, insisting that the real honor belonged to those who had not returned. Cameron later said, "Our victory came at a price. We stood on the shoulders of those who did not come back." And always, the question of X5 resurfaced. Post-war investigations attempted to piece together her final hours. Some evidence pointed to a depth charge attack. Other accounts suggested she may have reached the target and released her charges before being destroyed. The fragmentary nature of the records, compounded by the chaotic environment of the fjord, prevented any firm conclusion. Even sonar sweeps of Kofjord conducted decades later revealed only partial clues. A metallic anomaly here, a buried shape there, just enough to fuel speculation, but never enough to resolve it. Thus, X5's fate remained one of the Arctic War's enduring enigmas. As the war drew to a close, surviving members of the X-Craft teams were liberated and returned to Britain. They were greeted not with pomp, but with quiet admiration from fellow submariners who understood the risks they had faced. Many struggled with the memory of friends lost, and the sense that their work, though vital, had come at a heavy cost. Still, they carried themselves with the modest pride of men who had met an impossible challenge. In the decades since, Operation Source has been studied as a masterclass in ingenuity, bravery, and the strategic value of small unit operations. The lessons endure, that unconventional thinking can change the balance of a conflict, that determination can overcome overwhelming odds, and that mystery, like that surrounding X5, remains an inevitable part of war's chaotic landscape. And even now, beneath the cold waters of a fjord in northern Norway, the unanswered questions surrounding that missing miniature submarine still echo, a reminder of the courage of the men who ventured where no fleet could go, and of the stories that the sea keeps hidden in its depths.